We're so excited to have Seth with us today. Seth is the co-founder and co-director of Soil for Climate, which is a global movement of people championing soil as the solution to climate. So without further ado, we will turn the Zoom over to Seth for his presentation.
Excellent, thank you very much. Can you confirm that you see and hear me now?
Yes, we see and hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, so now I will share the PowerPoint. Oops, wrong slide. Hang on. Okay, do you see the PowerPoint slide?
Not right now.
Not quite yet.
Oh, okay, all right, hang on. Go to Zoom. Share screen. Okay. I imagine everybody goes through this, right? Not just me. Okay. All right, there we go. Okay, now I'm assuming you see the title slide.
Yep, that's
Yes.
perfect.
Soil for Climate. Okay, great. Well, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today at the NOFA New York conference. This really is a great joy and honor. And thank you for tuning in. I was about to say thank you for coming out, but thank you for tuning in. And so I'm Seth Itzkan, the co-founder and co-director of Soil for Climate. We're an advocacy group advocating for soil as a climate solution. And the title of the talk today is How Producers Can Be Climate Heroes. And let me say that I honestly mean that. I'm using those phrases deliberately, climate heroes, and hero in the true sense of the word, meaning someone who's literally perhaps saving someone's life. And that is the deal. That is what we believe, that there are the fate of humanity literally is in the balance here, and producers can play an essential role in helping to make the planet habitable, preserve that it will be habitable into the future. And so that isn't just hyperbole when I say climate heroes. We really believe that. And the arc of this presentation, if you will cover a lot of topics, sort of the big picture science about what is the climate crisis, how does it relate to soil, how does it relate to agriculture, how does it relate to grazing and grazing animals, and what we can do to literally reverse desertification and preserve our soil. So, okay, so sort of big pictures, and then there's very practical things like what sort of practices can we do, and markets and stuff like that, sort of the day-to-day reality, and we'll get into that as well. But really, the intent of this presentation is to give the big picture, literally the many millions of years picture of how the world got to where it is today in terms of soil, and how we're impacting it, and the change that we can make moving forward. Okay, so now I should be able to, okay. So, so we're a global advocacy organization, and these are just some pictures of us sort of representing soil as a climate solution around the world, including the COP21, known in the common vernacular as the Paris Climate Accords. Yes, we were there. It was a great honor to be there. And as you know, our new president just re-signed us, so we're getting back into it now. So I'm happy to see that. And just sort of pictures, around the world of our advocacy. There's Bill McKibben, the founder of 350.org. So, trying to connect with the message that this really is a climate solution. And this is me with Ratan Lal. He's generally regarded as the world's leading soil scientist, and his role in making the narrative between soil and climate is also very important. So we're honored to have a cordial relationship with him. Okay, and then getting the kids involved. All right, so here's a picture. You've all seen this, many times, of course. The sort of quintessential picture of the Earth from space. What I really sort of want to show in this picture, the sort of the point I want to make is really how thin the layer of water and atmosphere is on the Earth, you know, in relation to the size of the planet. I mean, it's really not even a veneer, or, you know, or you know, like paint on a ball. You know, the planet is 8,000 miles in diameter, and what we call the weather in the ocean is like a mile. It's like 1/8,000th. You know, so we really can impact the climate. That's kind of the cognitive threshold I want you to make. We really can. And okay, so now getting into the whole soil part of it, this is from an exhibit called Exposed: The Secret Life of Roots that the U.S. Botanical Society put on. And these are actual tall grass prairie plants and roots put against a backdrop, you know, of a cross-sectional photograph. But those are actual plants, and they're sort of hanging. And they were grown in tubes, and you could see how deep the root systems are, and how they're even folded at the bottom because they're so deep. And you know, what you want to see here is the reason why soil is dark. Literally, the reason it's dark is because of the carbon. You know, the soil organic matter is carbon. That's why, you know, graphite and charcoal and you know, that's sort of the color of carbon in organic matter. It makes things dark. And that's why, you know, sort of darker soil, it just intuitively is better than lighter soil. Why? Well, it has more organic carbon. So this is a great play here. All the carbon that's in the grasslands or in all the soils of the world, it all came from the atmosphere. Like, that's the only place it came from, and it got there through photosynthesis. This is sort of like a carbon flows slide, but what I want you to see here is, it's on my bottom left, maybe it's on your bottom right, I'm not sure, but see where it says soil 2300, that the bottom there and in the dark part with the soil, that means 2,300 billion tons, or 2,300 gigatons of carbon in soil. And then you see up in the atmosphere, it says 800, and then in plant biomass, it says 550. So what this is telling you is the vast majority of carbon on the landed surface of the Earth, okay, is in the soil itself. And then you see down at the bottom where it says fossil pool 10,000. Okay, so that's the fossil fuels, right? But at that point, you know, it's already sort of an entirely different state. But in terms of what, you know, we can work with and manage, you know, you want to see that soil is a major reservoir, the largest reservoir of carbon other than fossil fuels itself, much more so than the atmosphere and in plant biomass. That's sort of the takeaway from that slide. Okay, when I hit the continue button, for some reason it doesn't always continue. Oh, good heavens. Hang on. Okay, all right. This now is shows what they call the fluxes. Basically, what you're seeing here is of the source that is fossil fuels, there's only 3 sinks. And those sinks are the ocean, the atmosphere, and the terrestrial sphere. Now, a certain amount is going to dissolve into the oceans anyway, and a certain amount will be taken up by the terrestrial sphere anyway. But then what's left over is going into the atmosphere that's causing global warming. So 2 of these are basically bad, the oceans and the atmosphere. When it goes into the atmosphere, it makes global warming. When it goes in the oceans, it dissolves and becomes carbonic acid, which destroys coral reefs. So that's also bad. But the terrestrial sphere is good. We want the uptake into the terrestrial sphere. And so the role of our movement is to advocate for increasing that. Now, the role of 350.org and other climate organizations is to advocate for decreasing the source. Now, of course, we also advocate for that. And one of the ways to decrease it is to change agricultural policy. But basically what we're saying is that the uptake in the terrestrial sphere can be significantly increased. And then this is sort of a similar slide, but more on sort of like a map-like visual, but sort of similar information about sources and sinks into the land and into the ocean. And then what this slide is showing is that you see where it says potential land sink, that we can increase it. And it says if we increase it by 3.4% per year of what's already in the land reservoir, we can mitigate the increases from fossil fuels. And then if we decrease the fossil fuels, then we can actually start to get negative. We can actually start to draw the total excess reservoir of carbon in the atmosphere out. So we can actually go down, which is what we have to do. We have to go down. We can't even just stop where we are. We have to be decreasing the level in the atmosphere. And okay, well, this is a paper by a professor named Susan Solomon, and she showed that just even stopping emissions wouldn't be good enough. She says it's largely irreversible for 1,000 years after emissions stop. So just stopping isn't good enough. We actually have to have, a net drawdown. Okay, this is Susan Solomon. So she's with NOAA, an esteemed professor. Now, her paper came out in 2009. 4 years later, the IPCC, which is the organization that runs COP, and then the Paris Climate Accord is associated with that. They say a large fraction of anthropogenic climate change resulting from CO2 emissions is irreversible on a multi-century to millennial timescale. Okay, so they're referring to Susan Solomon. That's clearly they're referring to her work. But look at this phrase they add: except in the case of a large net removal of CO2 from the atmosphere over a sustained period. Except in the case of a large net removal of CO2 from the atmosphere over a sustained period. So that's, hello, welcome to this conversation. That's where we are. We're right there. The large net removal. That's what this is about, over a sustained period. Excuse me. And here we say, soil, that is the large net removal. It's going to be on soil restoration. Okay, you can literally see it. And then the question comes up, well, how does the carbon get into the soil in the first place? Well, it's what they call the Christine Jones and Elaine Ingham are major speakers in this space. Christine Jones talks about the liquid carbon pathway. Elaine Ingham talks about the soil food web. But basically, the plant roots actually secrete the carbon. It's almost like sap. You can almost think of like tree sap. Well, it comes out through the roots. And what they're doing is they're literally feeding the soil food web. And a lot of people think that the carbon in the soil comes from the decomposition of leaves on the top or something like that. That's not actually where it comes from. It actually comes through the roots itself. Okay, and then this slide also shows the relationship of carbon to water. And so there's a direct connection here. As the soil carbon increases, the ability for the soil to hold water also increases. And then you have more surface water, particularly into the dry seasons. And I do a lot of work in Africa, and I'll show you pictures from Kenya and Zimbabwe. And so they have these seasonal situations. They're otherwise fairly dry areas. And so maintaining soil carbon is really essential to restore the water cycle there, to keep it from turning into desert. And of course, it's true everywhere. So what are the main practices? We'll just hit on these really quickly, but obviously people talk about reforestation. That's what you see going on here. Well, this slide is meant to imply organics, but our organic vegetables. No-till is an essential, is a biggie in this space. Biochar, there's a whole community of people who are into that. What's good about biochars, it literally locks it up forever. I mean, for geological time. So let's hear it for biochar. And then really, this is the area that I'm going to spend most of my time talking about, which is using livestock as a proxy for the wild herds. And this, of course, is the work of Alan Savory and holistic management. And Carl and I are pretty steeped in that discipline. And I'm referring to my colleague, Karl Thidemann, who's on the program with us, and he'll take questions later. And so a lot of the work that we're doing is also sort of in drier areas, you know, like Kenya and Zimbabwe and Africa. And we're going to be starting a chapter in Pakistan. And, you know, these are a lot of areas in which the traditional agriculture really just doesn't work. It's too dry. And so you need to have a livestock approach to soil restoration. And so this is from Zimbabwe, from the Africa Center for Holistic Management. I took a picture. And, you know, and what you want to see here is the sense of the multi-species compact herd, goats. Well, I don't think they have sheep there, but anyway, you know, goats and cows, all grazing together, all in a fairly tight herd, moving according to the plan. And the restoration can be remarkable. I mean, literally within a few years, you can see the land recovering. And this is a picture from the Laboa section in South Africa. I imagine many of you have seen this picture before. It's become fairly common. A lot of people are showing it. I've been there. Okay, I've stood at that fence. This is in what's called the Karoo Desert, and even the term desert. Well, why is it called the desert? You know, why isn't it called the Karoo grassland, right? And you know, isn't it convenient that they just happen to put the fence here at the boundary between the desert and the grassland? I refer to this as the paradigm fence, because there literally is entirely different paradigms going on here in terms of land management, in terms of even thinking about what's possible. I'm sure if people, you know some background about me and Soil for Climate, you won't be surprised to hear that the land on the left, the good land, the grassland, has 4 times the animal density as the land on the right, 4 times. So the land is being restored because of the animals, not in spite of them, but because of them, and they're being managed properly. And so when you see a difference like this on the top, you know that if you take the soil sample, you're going to get darker soil. There's going to be more organic carbon. So the one on the left is contributing to climate change mitigation. So this practitioner is a climate hero, right? Okay, so here are the pictures from space. This is from Google Earth Pro. This exact same spot. And you know, I just want to, you know, say this. I get kind of frustrated, frankly, of hearing people say the Savory stuff is debunked or it doesn't work. It's like, I'm sorry, friends, you know, no more of that, okay? You can see the efficacy of this from space, all right? So, you know, enough nonsense about this isn't working. It is working, and the evidence is obvious and all over the world. And so here's examples of the transformation. And what you want to see here is the typical sort of bare ground for decades, literally, in a lot of the world in dryland areas is unfortunately like this. And then after they bring in the animals and they begin the restoration process, you have the annuals. Those are the first, you know, opportunistic plant to take over. But then eventually you start to get the deep-rooted perennials. You know, it takes some time, but then they start to show up, or what in Africa they call it the thatching grass. And just like the Texas blue stem, you know, that we have here in the United States. And then so this just shows the change, and then that's me. And so again, I don't take kindly to people saying this doesn't work. You know, as I like to say, I've stood in the efficacy. And then, so here's another site. So in the wet and dry season, some people say, oh, well, it's a dry season picture versus a wet season. Well, yes, things are green in the wet season, but the transformation from barren to you know, filled with cover, that takes, you know, many years, and that's not a seasonal thing. That's a transformation over time. And then what you want to see here in the top right, see where it says Panica maximum, that's what they call a high climax grass. See how small the little seed heads are. This grass can only grow in very healthy, you know, good soil with good moisture content. So that's what we call an indicator species. And then there in the bottom right, or my bottom right, you see the mycelium, see the mushroom, and then you see the centipede or millipede there. So really good, healthy soil life happening now. And again, this was the area that, what was for all practical purposes the same as this, deserted. They call this the elbow site because of the tree that sort of looks like an elbow. And then there's your transformation. That's Alan Savory, and I've taken this picture. And then there you go, exact same site. This is about 7 years. That's about what it takes. Like, you'll start to see a change within a year, but the real robust change, it takes about 7 years. Just here are some other examples of transformation. You may have seen these slides before if you've seen my talks. Here's our man Gabe Brown. Let's hear what he has to say.
So when my wife and I purchased this farm from her parents in 1991, soil organic matter levels on the cropland were 1.7 to 1.9%. And now the studies and samples we're taking show that our organic matter levels vary from 5.3 to 7.9% on that same land base. So we've been able to significantly cycle carbon and put more back into the cycle, into the soil. And I really believe soil carbon is a cycle, and it cycles much more readily than we think. The issue now is we have way too much in the atmosphere and not enough cycled into the soil where it can feed biology.
Well, I like to say Yebo a lot. It means yes, that's right in Zulu. It's a common term in Southern Africa.
So,
oops, hang on. Anyway, so the point there, what he was saying is he went from approximately 2% soil organic matter to 8%. That's a profound transformation, and he's in North Dakota. And 8% soil organic matter, that's 76 tons of carbon per acre to 12 inches. Well, it even goes a lot deeper than 12 inches. This is being a climate hero right here. When I talk about being a climate hero, this is what I'm talking about. And what's interesting, just sort of aside, is a lot of producers are frankly conservative in Middle America, and climate is still kind of like a politicized topic. And so you won't necessarily hear them talking about climate, but you will hear them talking about soil carbon. And from my point of view, I don't care. I don't care. You don't have to call it a climate solution if you don't want to. Just keep increasing the soil carbon. And then, so just also getting into the science, this is a seminal paper by Gregory Ritalik called Global Cooling by Grassland Soils of the Geologic Past and Near Future. And, I love the part about near future. He's implying we can do global cooling through grassland soils. So really wonderful to see this kind of research. This is 2013, really since around 2000 or so, a whole new wave of good research in this space has been coming out. And he talks about the evolution of what's called mollisols. And basically what we consider agricultural soil is, for most part, it is mollisol. Like that type of soil itself is a fairly recent evolutionary phenomena. And it evolved, not surprisingly, with the grazing ungulates and ruminants. It's a co-evolution of the animals and the mollisol soils itself and the carbon drawdown. These things are all happening together as part of one thing. But the point that he makes is that the ungulates, the large grazing animals, are essential to the formation of the soil itself. That's the key thing. It's not like there's the soil and then the animals showed up. The animals actually helped produce the soil. And there was this competition around 20 million years ago or so between sort of grasslands and forests. They were sort of competing with each other over land. And the grasslands, for all practical purposes, won. I mean, the earth used to be much more forested. and they sort of pushed the forests out. How did they do that? They did it with the animals. The animals were able to sort of move the domain of the grasslands. And then this is another paper called the 40 Million History of Atmospheric CO2. Well, I'll just sort of go through this quickly. What you see here is a profound change over that same period from, upwards of 1,600 parts per million CO2, down more or less to where we are now in the 350, 400 range. And then what I've done, or what Carl and I have done, is we've combined those two graphs. So we combined the paper from Retallick, where he shows the evolution of mollusols with the large grazing animals, with Yang's paper from 2013 on the 40 million year history of CO2. And you see there's a direct correlation between the emergence of these mollusol soils and the large grazing ungulates with the profound atmospheric drop in carbon dioxide. It's a direct correlation. And this really, if there's any takeaway from this, this is the one I want you to remember. Remember this slide. And then what we call agriculture, almost all of agriculture is C4 grasses: maize, sugar cane, millet, sorghum, Texas blue stem. That's also part of the evolution of this entire sort of a new type of ecology. This is basically a new type of ecology, and it's on evolutionary timeframes. 20 million years is like a blink of the eye, and this is all fairly recently that this has happened, and the atmospheric CO2 has been drawn down as a result of it. Now, of course, humans in the more recent time frame, like in the last 10,000 years or so, now we've been impacting land and climate sort of the other way. Now we've been killing the large animals, we've been burning the forests, we've been tilling the land. And so William Rudderman's thesis is that we've actually have already held off the next ice age. We should already be in the next ice age. It should have started 8,000 years ago. And why hasn't it? Well, this just gets into the sort of the ice age cycles. We don't need to get into that. But the point is, good 8,000 years ago, by the natural ice age cycles, carbon dioxide should have been going down, the planet should have been getting colder. Instead, it's been getting warmer, CO2 has been going up. So humans have been contributing to global warming for 8,000 years. That's another takeaway I want you to get from this. For 8,000 years, we've been contributing to global warming. First, by killing the megafauna that made the mollusols in the first place, then using fire, and then tillage, agriculture. But by the time we got to tillage, we'd already been, hunting for tens of thousands of years, killing off the megafauna. And then this just shows the methane. So the previous one was CO2, this one is methane. Methane started going up about 5,000 years ago. Okay, and then he shows the temperature. We should have been a good 5,000 years already into the next ice age. We've been holding off an ice age for millennia, just with arrows and stone tools and fire. And now I just want to talk about even the notion of sort of desertification in general. Well, we talk about the Sahara Desert, sort of this archetype desert in the world, right? But it didn't used to be a desert. It used to be a tall grass prairie with all kinds of animals and lakes and lots of surface moisture. This is fairly well established. I mean, they know exactly where the lakes were, and there's fossils of sea creatures, and there's drawings. There's cave art of early cave art of aquatic life, in the middle of the quote unquote desert now. And so, well, what happened? Okay, well, there are natural cycles. And one of the cycles is what they call the intertropical convergence zone, okay, or the ITCZ. And that does change over geologic time, and that does change the moisture patterns. And so that is a natural pattern anyway, that there is these sort of oscillations between drier and wetter times in sort of the central part of the world. However, the last desertification period that happened in the Sahara Desert, which was much too fast and much too severe than would have been predicted by the models or by the historic patterns. These are fairly regularly established patterns. And so something happened. What was it? Well, okay, well, this just shows the changing rain patterns. That's all right. And then here's sort of the cave art that shows that, you know, life in the Sahara was abundant. Okay, well, you know, what happened? The thesis, of course, is what humans, you know, we killed off the megafauna, and then we brought in domestic animals, and then there was the improper sort of overgrazing, and a lot of people, a lot of the narrative is blaming desertification on the domestic animals, but see, that's not the problem. The problem was the killing of the megafauna in the first place, the large herds. By the time the domestic animals showed up with the, you know, some goats and cows, we'd already changed the paradigm of the ecology. And then, yes, we were overgrazing, that's true, but we just weren't grazing properly. And so the whole point of the Alan Savory work and the holistic management work is to have these goats and cows now be a proxy for those herds that used to exist. And you know, I know I'm maybe running short on time, but just these are sort of important themes that I want you to get. I mean, as producers, I would like you to also be scientists, frankly, to really understand the science here. And this is an important graph. What this shows is that fossil fuels didn't become the leading contributor to carbon loading in the atmosphere until 1960. You see that intersection there? That the cultivation of soil itself has been the leading contributor of carbon into the atmosphere for 10,000 years until 1960. Just happens to be the year I was born. So there you have it. Blame it on me, right? It's my fault. Okay. Then another thing I want you to understand here is the relationship between grasses and rain. And there's sort of this magic period of, you know, around 15 to around 30 inches of rain a year. The whole world, other than the United States, uses millimeters. So you're 500, 800 millimeters is sort of the typical range. And that's the range in which you have these really healthy soils and grasslands and the grazing animals. And this shows what's called the short, medium, and tall grass prairie ecosystems where they used to exist. And then this is sort of a composite image. So you can see that where the tall, medium, and short grass prairie systems were is right in that rainfall, you know, right in that range, that 20 to 30, 33 inch, you know, range of rainfall. That's where it shows up. And it's like that everywhere around the world. Most of Africa, most of Central Asia, large parts of South America, Australia. This is really sort of the dominant ecosystem rain paradigm type. It's sort of rain in that range, some type of grassland, some types of herding animals. And I'm just showing, you know, the composite and the components here. And this is now what we call agriculture. And bang, so here's your soybeans. This just happens, it could be corn or millet, it doesn't matter. It's all, you know, more or less the same areas, right? It's all the areas that were sort of the tall and medium prairie. And of course, and this is what you have today, you know, the fertilizer. And look at all the bare ground there. I mean, it's mostly bare. You know, these should be tall grass prairies with grazing. And so here are the consequences of it, right? So now you have flooding, and eventually we're going to have just complete desertification. So so the heroes, if you will, getting back to the theme of this talk is about heroes, are the people who turn this around. And part of our job, frankly, when I say our job, I mean me and Carl and other people we work with, is to work on the policy to help reward producers for doing the right thing. So all the policy instruments that are in place now are all the wrong things, right? You know, you get the rebates and the tax credits for destroying the land, and it needs to be the opposite. And so we're working with that. So there's a whole policy front of this. Right now, I just kind of want you to get the science. And then of course, you know, this used to be an animal continent. This is in North America. There used to be 35 to 75 million buffalo, but you know, not just buffalo, pronghorn, other megafauna, and approximately 4 billion prairie dogs. 4 billion. You know, think of that. And then this was the buffalo genocide. It was intentional, right? That was completely intentional to kill the buffalo. This picture was probably taken around 1890, and then bang, 40 years later, you start to get dust bowls. And the question mark says, well, is there a connection? Well, yes, obviously there's a connection. When you kill off the megafauna, the soil in a grassland ecosystem starts to die. So now that's sort of the bad news. The good news is that we can reverse it. All right, I'm just gonna go through this quickly, and there's good science now coming out. Look at the title, another seminal paper, 2016. I mean, just only, you know, what, 5 years ago. The role of ruminants in reducing agriculture's footprint in North America. Ruminants reducing agricultural's carbon footprint. So this is, you know, important developments. And then this table just shows what the actual sort of drawdown is in terms of gigatons per year as a scenario. This is the paper in which AMP grazing is in which that term is introduced. It was the first time that term shows up in peer-reviewed literature. AMP stands for adaptive multi-paddock grazing, adaptive multi-paddock. But, you know, wink, wink, we all know that that means holistic management. But in the more academic language, that's the shape of it. AMP grazing, adaptive multi-paddock grazing. And then here's the drawdown scenario that this paper suggests is possible. I think I have another, yeah. So 1.2 gigatons of carbon per year, or 12% of all global emissions. So he's saying just in North America, so just North America can be drawing down 12% of all global emissions just by doing AMP grazing and what he calls conservation cropping. Now, in the sake of time, I'll just go through these very quickly, but that basically was the science, if you will. So now what we want to do is we want to start to restore the world, frankly. And so Soil for Climate is working with a group in Kenya, with the Maasai community in Kenya. And we're beginning to do holistic plant grazing project there. You know, but not just that, also the pollinator project with beehives. So, you know, all of the restorative practices that are possible in a sort of low rainfall system. So there isn't going to be any traditional agriculture. I mean, this is almost entirely like a grazing type ecosystem here. And then, you know, so there's this area called Maasai lands. It's sort of like a virtual country between southern Kenya and northern Tanzania. And we think there was really sort of great opportunity there to, you know, this is in part where humanity started. And so sort of like reboot humanity, you know, in terms of how we manage our land in a restorative way. And so there's just sort of another view of it. And then, you know, but again, sort of getting back to the bad side, well, this is what they're dealing with, right? Drought, you know, and flooding, and look at the land. I mean, you know, Kenya didn't used to look like that, right? Obviously, you know, where's all the grass? Where's all the animals? And so this is what shows up on the news, right? You hear a news story, starving people, and you see these depleted landscapes and some goats walking around. Like, what's going on? You know, how did it get like this? And how's it going to get better? And so that's our role here. And well, this just shows now that the anomalies in terms of the Indian Ocean getting warmer, and then the excessive rains showing up in East Africa. And then, so this is my colleague, Dalmas T. and Patty in Kenya. We're soulmates now at this point. I'm formally adopted into his family and into his community there. And so we're working on the restoration program. Looking at the time here, so they've done, you know, the training in holistic plant grazing, and there's the Mara Training Center in West Kenya is a savory hub, and so now they're starting to do it, getting more herds, more families contributing to the herd, a grazing plan. And then, you know, here just some, you know, pictures of community engagement. This is all part of the, and so his organization is called the Maasai Center for Regenerative Pastoralism. And so we're sort of like partner organizations here. And yeah, okay. And so our project, Maasai Lands Restoration Project. So that's a collaboration of Soil for Climate and the Maasai Center for Regenerative Pastoralism. And, you know, I just kind of need to move quickly, but so we built a new boma for them, or corral, whatever you want to call it. We bought a bull. That's not a trivial thing. Helping to buy cows. So think about this. So in order to restore the soil and mitigate global warming, we're buying cows. You see how that's like just goes against all the narratives you're used to hearing. Oh, cows are bad. It's like, no, cows are good. They need to be managed properly. And so we're actually increasing the herd for them. Okay, so this is the University of Nairobi. We made a presentation there. Going to get a new generation of young intellectuals, frankly, from the area who are interested in this. And then these are just, you know, some pictures of, you know, trying to make the point. I have more slides, as is always the case, but why don't I just stop now? And or I tell you what, let me just go through real quick and see if there's just maybe one or two other slides I need to get. No, that's okay. You've got. You
have another 15 minutes until we should go to questions. So if there's something you want to cover, we do have some time.
You know, no, I mean, I think, you know, that that we've you know what, let me just show this slide. Because what I did here was to help bring it sort of closer to home. I drew an equivalent area on the United States of the Maasai Lands area. It's about 42,000 square miles. And that just happens to be about the size of Iowa. And Iowa is a key state in this conversation, as you know, a major agricultural state. And so just to help make it, you know, like I said, closer to home, you see, it's all the same thing. You know, okay, Kenya, the Maasai, Tanzania, that seems exotic to us. Oh, it's over there. But you see, it's right here. It's the same story. It's the same ecosystem, the same type of evolution. Iowa is maybe a little wetter than southern Kenya. You know, maybe you could move that illustration there, maybe, you know, a little more to the west, a little slightly drier regions. But you see, it's the same story. It's the same type of ecosystem that in both cases has been decimated and now can also be restored. So that was just the point of this slide, to kind of, like I said, sort of bring the message closer to home. Okay, no, I want to stop there because we really want to have a discussion, not just take questions. So I'm going to stop now. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that presentation. I know I definitely have a lot to think about. You put a lot of really good ideas in my head. We do have a question in the chat from Angela. And she just says she would like to get a copy of the AMP chart if possible. And I guess I would like to possibly pile onto that. Do you have like a bibliography or works cited? You referenced a lot of really awesome articles, and it would be great to be able to read the whole articles for ourselves.
Sure. And in the chat area, I can drop Zoom. How come I don't see the chat window? But I should be able to drop it right into the chat window, right? The link to our papers.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. I'd like to actually invite my colleague Carl to come in and see if he wants to add a few points. And then in the meantime, I'll find the URL to our bibliography and I'll drop that in the chat window. Carl, do you want to add anything?
Thank you, Seth. Yes, hello, everybody. A couple of questions that often come up related to this topic is basically how quickly, what can the global impact be? And one of the earliest slides that Seth showed was of Dr. Ratan Lal, who's at Ohio State University. He's been publishing on soil carbon drawdown since the 1980s, and his work is widely considered the most credible in the field. And essentially the challenge right now is that we have about roughly 300 billion extra tons of carbon in the atmosphere that we need to remove. That equates to approximately 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide. And Ratan Lal has estimated that over the next 80 years, 80 years, by the year 2100, that a combination of reforestation and regenerative agricultural practices could remove all of the excess carbon from the atmosphere and bring the world back essentially to the pre-industrial level of below 300 parts per million, down to about 270 parts per million. There are some estimates that are even higher than that. The fact of the matter is that we don't know, and we won't know until we actually start doing it in earnest. It's also, I would also add that it's important to restore all ecosystems, not simply the farmland and the cropland, the grazing lands that we have now, but truly every ecosystem on the planet, including the oceans, the forest, wetlands, and so forth. And there are literally billions of hectares of, as Seth showed, degraded grasslands around the world that today we call deserts, but in fact they're man-made deserts. A classic example is just here in the American Southwest. A couple of years ago, National Public Radio ran a story about the terrible desertification going on in Flagstaff, Arizona. And when the story ended, I went to the National Weather Service website to see, well, what is the rainfall that they're having there? The annual rainfall, it turns out, was about 22 to 24 inches per year. Now, a healthy grassland can thrive on as little as 4 inches of rain per year, according to Dr. David Montgomery, who's well known for his books, Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations and Growing a Revolution. So here we have a situation of a land area that's getting literally 6 times more rainfall than it needs to be a healthy grassland. Why is it dying? Why is it turning into desert? And it's not, as most people would say, because of inadequate rainfall. That's not the problem at all. The problem is lack of beneficial ruminant impact. Grasslands co-evolved with grazers over the past 40 million years. And if you take the grazing animals off the land, then as Seth has shown in his slides, the land will turn to desert. And there is no magic technology that can restore this land. The only thing that can bring it back is the proper grazing of animals, the hoof action to break up the hard capped soil, to allow the rainfall to get into the soil, to restore the soil life, the properly timed grazing to make sure that the plants have an opportunity to grow back fully before they're grazed a second time. And what's exciting about this is it's not only getting the carbon out of the air, but it's also restoring ecosystems that can allow for all wildlife to thrive. On a well-managed farm, on any given day, the wildlife may only be occupying just a few % of the area of the entire farm or ranch, with the other 96, 97% available for wildlife. This has been the experience in Zimbabwe at the Africa Center for Holistic Management, where if you want to see wild animals, that is the place to go, even though it's a working ranch. During times of drought, the giraffes and elephants and lions and zebras and so forth, they actually leave the national parks that are turning into desert to make the journey over to this ranch where they can find abundant feed and water. And also related to water, as Seth alluded to, we often hear how much water it takes to produce a pound of beef, for livestock, that sort of thing. And a couple of points. First of all, those statistics which sometimes seem astronomically high, actually include the amount of rainfall that fell on the crops that are feeding the animals. This is rain that would have fallen anyway, whether it was growing crops for animals or not. And the fact of the matter is that when the grazing is done properly and the land is being healed and the carbon level is going up, the soil is holding more water. Each 1% increase in soil organic matter allows each acre of land to hold approximately 20,000 more gallons of water. So that when you do the grazing properly, the landscape actually has more water in it than it did before. So it's not a net loss of water, it's actually an increase of water. And it's so counterintuitive for many people to think that grazing can actually be so beneficial in this way, but that in fact is the case. And there are now many conservation organizations around the world, and including the Nature Conservancy and Conservation International, World Wildlife Fund in Australia, and others are now using managed grazing as a way of restoring wildlife habitat. National Audubon has a program to use managed grazing they call it conservation ranching, to restore habitat for songbirds and so forth. So I know that's a mouthful, so I'll pause there and hear if there are questions. Now it looks like we have some what's going on in the chat window. Oh, okay, those are all Seth's notes. Well, while I have your attention, I would also, perhaps I could bring up the issue of methane, which is another concern that people have about grazing. And a couple of points there. If you look at the ice core records that we now have going back some 800,000 years, during a time when the world was filled with more types of ruminants than we can even imagine today, the methane levels in the atmosphere were about 1/3 to 1/4 of what they are presently. The leading sources of methane to the atmosphere today, of course, are is the two things. It's the fossil fuel industry, but also the manufacturing of fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer, releases a massive amount of methane. Also, the production of rice is a very high source of methane. This is not to say that ruminants don't produce methane, they do. The way methane is broken down in the atmosphere, there are two ways. There are bacteria in soil called methanotropes that metabolize or oxidize a relatively small percentage of the methane. Most of the methane is oxidized in the atmosphere. It has a half-life of about 10 years in the atmosphere. There's a reaction involving hydroxy radicals in the troposphere, the lower level of the atmosphere. And what this means is that unlike what's called a stock gas like carbon dioxide that builds up in the atmosphere for 1,000 years or more after it's emitted, most of the methane, a large portion of it, is gone within 10 years. So if the animal size does not increase, the amount of methane being generated from it in the atmosphere does not increase either. So the warming effect remains constant. This is very unlike if you have a fleet, say, of 100 cars or a fleet of or a herd of 100 cows. The impacts on the atmosphere are radically different. There are two scientists at Oxford, Dr. Miles Allen and Dr. Michelle Kane. 2 years ago, they put out a paper calling for a new metric to measure the global warming response from methane, specifically because of this difference between how these short-lived gases and long-lived gases respond. The metric you might have heard of is called the carbon dioxide equivalent, in which all different gases are related or compared to the warming impact of carbon dioxide. The new metric is called the global warming potential star. Because Dr. Miles Allen has been a lead author on a number of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports and is considered a leading authority in this subject, there's a very good chance that this new metric is going to be adopted, and it places a much lower value on the warming impact from methane. So I'll give somebody else a chance to talk. Seth, I don't know if you have some questions or if you have some points you want to add to what I've said.
There is a question in the chat, and I don't know if this is for Seth or Karl or both of you. But Steph Hinkie asks, I think a great number of us are vegetable farmers. Our location is probably best used for vegetables or mixed animal vegetables farms. We also have maybe twice the rainfall. Please comment on best practices for the Northeast. And Ren kind of adds to that question and asks, are there ways we could contribute to this effort on a smaller scale without livestock?
Sure, Seth.
Yeah, Carl, let me grab that first. I actually did see that in the chat window, and I did start answering in there. So obviously in a place like New York, where you've got 40 inches of rain or more, it's sort of more forgiving, if you will. So basically, you just don't want to do tillage, and almost anything other than tillage, will be okay. But the cover crops and the no-till, we're talking about in a cropping operation. But to the extent that you can integrate grazing, somehow, that will help. And now, Gabe Brown, he's in North Dakota, so much less rain than you get. So for him, it made a big difference. And now, of course, if you were in the Southwest, you couldn't do agriculture at all. You could only do grazing. So, you could see how the whole sort of system moves. And when you get, to New York, you frankly, you have more options. And then the question becomes, well, how do you get rewarded for that? And, this is the whole policy thing. Like, okay, does that mean you have to be selling beef or leasing your land for someone to graze on it some time of the year? Or is there another type of reward you could get through better policy that's actually monitoring soil health and is rewarding you for improving your soil carbon and creating disincentives for destroying it? I mean, this is a policy discussion. And and I invite you to look at the policy page that I've put up, including for New York. Now, there are several bills right now that are pending in New York. I'm assuming this is largely a New York crowd. There's a Carbon Farming Act and there's a Carbon Farming Tax Credit, both of which are pending right now in New York. So I put that link there. I'll put it up again. But you need to become an activist. You need to be a scientist and an activist and a producer. Unfortunately, you have to do everything, or you need to call up your state rep and say, hey, how about this, these bills that are pending? Are you going to move forward on that? We need it. So I don't want to get into the details about practice because I'm not advertising myself as a practitioner. So we're advocates, and there are a range of practices that are beneficial, and there's a range of policy formations that are beneficial.
Yeah, I'd like to second what Seth said. Neither of us are farmers. We came to this from our work in climate activism. Seth had experience in the software industry. I myself have experience in environmental chemistry and with electric vehicles. And essentially, we founded Soil for Climate in response to our awareness that just simply cutting emissions wasn't going to be good enough. We also had to do something about getting the excess carbon out of the atmosphere. And our searching led us to discover the potential of regenerative agriculture. To the points that Seth has made, I would add that farmers in the Northeast, if you're not using livestock, can certainly use compost and mulch, compost tea, roller crimpers for knocking down crops, for growing potatoes. In Gabe Brown's book, he describes how he essentially grows them underneath a layer of compost or mulch, so that he doesn't have to actually till the soil to be able to grow the potato crop. If folks have not heard of, Seth mentioned Dr. Christine Jones. She's got a terrific video. In fact, I'll post it in the chat window in a moment. There are two. One is what she calls the liquid carbon pathway, which, as Seth explained, is the process in which plants, through their root exudates, put carbon into the ground. And there's also something she talks about called quorum sensing. Quorum in the sense of needing to have enough people present to vote and make a decision in an organization. And quorum sensing was first discovered back in the 1970s. It's a principle of bacteria. It's how they communicate to each other or with each other. And the initial work was done actually in bioluminescent bacteria from the ocean. And what the scientists discovered was that if you only had a few of these bacteria in a test tube, they wouldn't glow. It was only when there was a certain number of them that suddenly all of them would switch on and begin glowing. And led to research that found that not only did this phenomenon apply to bacteria of one type, but also to bacterial communities. So it turns out the more different types of bacteria you have, more and more different properties can be expressed. Each type of plant feeds a certain bacterial community in the ground. So the more different types of plants that you have feeding the soil life, the greater the diversity of the life in the soil itself. And by including as many different plants in a cover crop mix as possible, will accelerate the increase in the growth of the soil health, of the soil organic matter, and so forth. Christine Jones recommends at least a dozen different types of plants, including cool and warm season grasses and forbs and legumes to help trigger this phenomenon. I believe Gabe Brown uses cover crop mixes that can include 30, 40, 50 or more different types of plants at one time. And I will also post in the window, I know there's some great seed companies locally, but there's a good resource at a company called greencoverseed.com. They have what they call their mix calculator. And if you put in your zip code, it will show you what types of plants will thrive in your region and also help you to accomplish whatever it is that you need to do, whether it's to bust up tough soil or to regenerate degraded soil or so forth. So I'll put those links in the chat window now.
So we have one comment in the chat that I just want to read. Steph says she grew 1/20th of an acre of potatoes under mulch last year with success. So it's always good to hear from producers who are doing things successfully. And then Robert asks, always curious, what is contribution of methane over centuries of ruminants? Is it constant /more/less as domestic animals replace wild herds?
Carl, do you want to take the first crack at that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've seen conflicting scientific papers as to how the number of ruminants on the planet today compared to years past. So I don't have an exact number on that. It's also quite challenging to distinguish between the methane signal coming from biogenic or natural sources in some cases and methane coming from fracking. There are different practices that release methane that show very similar to what is coming from natural sources. So unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for you in that. I wish I did, but I don't.
But what I can say or add to that is that you know, the levels were fairly steady during what's called, you know, the Holocene, and they didn't really start going up until about 5,000 years ago, and it wasn't a sudden predominance of cattle that made the methane go up. It was the death of the soil because there's what's called methanotrophs or methane metabolizing bacteria in the soil. And so there would have been a natural sink, and we've destroyed the sink. And so that's when things started to get out of balance. That's when methane started to go up. So carbon dioxide started to go up about 8,000 years ago. Methane started to go up about 4,000 years ago. But the newest research now with the regenerative grazing has shown that when you're restoring soil and you're building the layer of methanotrophs and you're bringing down the carbon dioxide, that more than compensates for the methane produced by the ruminant, more than compensates for it. In fact, that paper, I believe, is in the compendium that I gave you the link to.
And there's also research, Dr. Fred Provenza, showing that when animals are being grazed properly, then the plants that they're eating tend to be much higher in protein and a lot lower in cellulose. So the animals end up producing less methane as well.
Well, thank you guys so much. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. You're both so knowledgeable, and I feel like you both offered both a clear path to how we got where we are, and potentially ways as producers we can approach making climate change a little bit less scary and more actionable. So I really appreciate both of your presentations.
Well, thank you. I mean, my own ask, if it were, or an invitation, is to join the Soil for Climate Facebook group. That's where we're really most active. And and also to be involved with healthy soils legislation. Those two things are really key.
And if people do have any questions about anything we've said, or if you want further resources, happy to send out information on grazing. There are methane articles and research papers that Seth and I can share on wildlife habitat restoration. If you give talks or presentations in your own communities or at your farm, and if you would like information to be able to provide to your customers or to your community members, please feel free to use us as a resource. We can be reached through direct message on Facebook. I'm happy to put my email address in here. I'll just do that now if people want to reach out directly. And I can put Seth's in as well.
Okay. And excuse me, you know, just like a last thing here, like, you know, Carl and I, quite frankly, are involved in some pretty heated discussions online, and there's a strong movement to really shame agriculture and to shame animal agriculture. And there are a lot of things that are wrong, but creating Impossible Burgers or going vegan is not the answer. You know, the answer is better agricultural and grazing management. And, you know, this is our sort of political flag that we carry. But I just want anyone out there, you know, not to feel like they're the problem, like you're the solution. Like I started this talk, it was called How Producers Can Be Climate Heroes. And we really mean that. Like, you really are heroes. And that's the narrative that people need to understand. And we really can green the Sahara. That's not just hyperbole. We can, in fact, regreen deserts. And it can happen actually very quickly. So as long as we start focusing on soil and soil restoration, the discussion about food and should I be vegetarian or whatever, it goes away. Say, well, how can you produce food in a way that restores soil? You know, it just keep it that simple. And the foods that are restoring soil will be the healthiest food, and they'll be integrated somehow with some sort of livestock operation. You know, there you go. There you have it.
Thank you all. Appreciate your attention and your questions.